Rooks are one of my favorite pieces, but I'm going to be honest, most people don't know how to use them correctly. All they are looking for are some cheap backrank mates, but they are much more powerful than you might think. The first things you have to learn are endgame defenses. Lesson number 1. The Philidor Defense. Look at this position. The black pieces are in the back rank, and they seem in a tough spot. White has a rook at a7 and a passed pawn which could easily turn into a queen. So, is black losing? Well, maybe if they haven't watched this video. Here is the main idea. The white king wants to progress the pawn but also move the king, so the pawn has some kind of defense. Now that you know that, all the rook has to do is stop that from happening. We don't want the king to move forward, so we go to c6. The sixth rank is now blocked. Most players would just move the pawn forward to f6 thinking, oh, the king can now go forward. And it can, but it won't end well. After the pawn, we put the rook all the way to the first rank. So, when the king tries to move forward, well, we just check him. Eventually, white will either draw by repetition or leave the pawn. And from there, we just exchange pieces. And don't worry, it also works on the rows too. Same idea. You just don't let the king make any progress. The key thing to remember is that the sixth rank is your way to drawing these games. It doesn't matter what the opponent does. All that matters is that the king doesn't cross that rank. But what if the king crosses that rank? Lesson number 2. The longside defense. This method is when the Philidor doesn't work. There are some conditions though. The defending king has to be in the short side. g7 if the pawn and king are on the e file, and b7 if they are on the d file. Remember, we are playing as black, but if we had the white pieces, our squares would be g2 and b2. The second condition is that the defending rook, the black rook in our case, has to be 3 squares away from the enemy king. I know remembering conditions seems hard, but you really have to do it because the rest is really simple. All we have to do is check the king until he goes far away from the pawn, and then we snatch it. Okay, that was fun. For the black pieces at least, but now that gives you an opportunity to learn lesson number 3. The Lucena position. Basically how to not let that happen as white.
Jesse, we have to cook.
And win the game. This is the position. Pretty much same as last time, but the rooks are in different places. The black king is in g7, and we know how bad that can be. So we check him, and he has to move. If king goes f6, well, we can just place our king to f8, and the queen is coming. If the king retreats to somewhere like h6, then we place our rook 2 squares away from our pawn. Then we move the king, slowly going up, until we can finally block the check with our rook. Exchange rooks, and we transform the pawn into a strong queen. Lesson number 4. Rook preferences. Now that the defense basics are out of the way, you need to understand how to use the rooks effectively. Did you know that rooks like to be in certain places? One of them is behind passed pawns. Look at this position. White has a pawn on a5 and a rook on d5. Where should the rook go to protect the pawn? The answer is to go d4. Opponent's rook goes a6 and ours goes a4. Rook being behind the passed pawn works well for multiple reasons. The first one is obvious. It's protecting the pawn and the opponent always has to worry about it reaching the last rank. Secondly, it controls the board. Now the 4th rank is locked. The black king cannot cross that, so in endgames where the king activity wins games, it really is a big deal. If black is slow like in our case, then the king penetrates defenses, and this is an easy game to win. The best part about this is that the king can never threaten that passed pawn because if it does, we are more than happy to let it go. Okay, that was just one of the rook preferences. The second one is a bit more controlling, and that is the principle that rooks most of the time are best in the 7th rank. I mean, think about it. Double rooks on the 7th rank? That's a menace. Most checkmates happen when the rook teams up with another piece in that rank. You know how deadly that can be to fight against, but look at this position. Both pieces are pretty much the same, with white having just one more pawn but the king is in the 3rd rank, while the black king is chilling in the 8th. So, what we have to do next is pretty obvious. Move the rook to the last rank, checking the king. Huh? Wasn't the 7th rank the best choice? Yes, it was. But something better than the 7th rank is being in that rank and having an extra move. Here's what I mean. Firstly, the king has to move. He goes b7. Now we check again. Here the opponent can either step back to the 8th rank or go f6 or h6. If the king goes to h6, well, we just win. If the king goes to f6, well, we just take the h-pawn and it's pretty much over. So the king obviously goes back to the 7th rank, accomplishing one of its main goals, locking the king to the last rank, and now with an extra move. We just go to a7, setting eyes on the pawn ahead. If we let the game play out, you can see that the rook continues to limit the king. At this point, that pretty much becomes his job, defending the passed pawn, locking out the opponent's king, and coordinating with its king to finally deliver the pawn to the finish line. Lesson number 5. Rook activity. We will start with the relationship between the rook and the king. Look at this position. The game looks equal. We are playing as white, and most beginners would look at this rook and think, I wish this rook could go behind the enemy defenses. But in an equal game like this, that cannot happen. Instead of wasting all those moves with the rook, we just put the king to use and try to get him into the center. The black king does the same. When the black king reaches d6, we of course have to move, threatening the a8 pawn, and the opponent protects it with its own rook. However, here is where the rook strategies start to change. After a bit of moving, we arrive at pawn b4. White is using the pawns to push forward. The rook tries to stop it, but it goes back to the a8 square. Both rooks are doing pretty much one job, and that is focusing on the a6 pawn, and that is generally not good. I mean, your pieces are worth 5 points, so you have to utilize their abilities. That is why white then goes pawn e4, offering a pawn exchange. And if the exchange is successful, then we are left in this board. Let's analyze a bit. The 5th rank is now open, and the rook both attacks the a-pawn, but also maintains control of the 5th rank to stop the kingside pawns. Black's rook is stuck behind its own pawn, but it is not passed. So this is not where it wants to be. Now the white king and the rook can work towards the weak h7 pawn. It's a small advantage, but most games are going to be like that. However, know this. You are going to be a better rook player following the principles shown in this video, but you have to apply them in a constant and patient way. That's it. Go watch this video now and become a better chess player. Maybe even subscribe for more lessons.